Now, I think part of the reason for this failure is, one is just like, material and organizational. The left has very little capacity. It doesn't have billionaires backing it. It doesn't have huge power structures or apparatuses. It doesn't have dense networks of institutions the way that religious movements do, entire communities. In the U.S. During the Bush era, there was a lot of discussion and reporting on how these mega churches were really the complete center of communities, especially the exurbs. These places of just kind of endless sprawling suburbs that exist along highways that have no real center, and the mega churches. It wasn't just spiritual life, right? It provided community life, provided childcare, provided art classes, for teenagers, music, businessmen lunches. It provided kind of this holistic community life. The left used to do this a century ago, say with the German Social Democratic Party, even with communist parties, where they would provide this kind of like holistic life where people lived together, worked together, played together, where there were these dense networks of media, of theater, of educational institutions. We don't really see that today. Instead, what we have is a left that fetishizes I think really just silly things like horizontalism, leaderless movements, networks, and hives. You can't fight power unless you build power. You're never going to fight the state. You're never going to fight capital through leaderless movements. One, it's simply not true. I'm from New York, and I spent a bit of time at Occupy Wall Street, and I was literally, I won't say I was yelling at people, but I would chastise them over social media when they talk about a leaderless movement, because it's just like, I know all of you. It's a couple hundred of you, okay? You guys are the leaders. Stop trying to deny that you aren't the leaders. You're the ones who are calling all the shots. You're the ones who are having the meetings behind the scenes. You're the ones who are starting the projects, right? They're always leaders. And, we can go back to... try to remember the tyranny of structurelessness, for the important essay from second wave feminism. I'm forgetting the name of the author, Joe Friedman, right? That it's just like, if there is still leaders without a structure, it's unaccountable leadership, and this is what the left needs. We need power, but it has to be. You need leaderships that's democratic, that's accountable, that's transparent. Otherwise, you get corrupted movements, like much of organized labor is today. But more than that, the left needs a libidinal politics. It needs to put pleasure and desire back at the center of politics. So the left just tends to focus on these very reductionist economic models or arguments, where what we need is a program. We just need this social democratic program to give people housing and education and healthcare and food. And of course, those are all important, but you need much more motivating ideology. You need that emotional appeal. You need that libidinal appeal where people can get pleasure out of the politics. And the left used to offer that, particularly in the 60s. The left was in the forefront of that with Marcuse's theories, with second wave feminism, the gay liberation movement, right? It was the gay liberation movement, not the gay rights movement. We could all be gay, that this is something we could all take pleasure in. The left really doesn't do that anymore. So the left needs to think about, where, the libidinal appeal could come from. Could it come from, the feminism, Marcuse, this idea of emancipation? Or maybe it could come from redemption, something that Martin Luther King talked about. Ironically, when you're in a movement like Occupy, like the beginnings of it, I don't want to say it was revolutionary, but it had, people talked about it as being revolutionary. But when a mass movement like that springs into being, it's very uninhibited. Everything is kind of open, and you see this desire, you see this pleasure, like all parts of life are accounted for. But historically, as revolutions age over time, they become institutionalized and regularized. And what they almost always end up doing is they squeeze out the chaotic, the heterodox, kind of that delirious wild abandon that first drew people in. And so I think that's something that the left needs to think about, like how does it actually institutionalize kind of these wilder elements of the self and society. Now, I want to say in terms of like an organizing strategy for how to approach the moment, especially going forward. And this is something that I learned through years of reporting, the left, I think, really needs to get back much more to the Socratic method. It needs to stop hectoring and lecturing. It needs to stop moralizing, condemning, and getting on its soapbox. What the left really needs to do is listen. Just listen to people very carefully. They'll say all sorts of screwed up and offensive things, but still, just listen and keep listening. Learn to develop your listening skills. You don't neutralize poison by forcing it back into the body politic. Once you start condemning people, you're going to make them defensive. You neutralize poison by drawing it out. And what I found it's through the asking of questions that is the way you can actually I think the left can counter this disequilibrium by causing confusion and cognitive dissonance among people themselves. I'll give a little example. Patrick Coburn, one of the great English language journalists of the Middle East, has this really amusing story about there's a simple way to just completely confound any expert on international relations. If you're hearing someone holding forth about, like, say, the conditions in Iraq or Libya or Russia or wherever, you just let them keep going and going and going and talking all about, the different power centers and the different forces at play, the geopolitics. And then eventually what you do is just ask them, but what about the conditions in the South? Surely they must be different. And he says every time that you'll find that'll flummox an expert. So I think part of the thing is we have to find ways to actually flummox people, right? To flummox the Trump supporters. Like let them have their spiel, and an effective question that I often use when people are talking about how they support something, some sort of bankrupt ideology. I'll let them go on, and then I'll just be like, so how's that working out for you? And often often they don't have a response because it isn't working out for them. Now, the title of this conference is Crisis and Resistance. And, I was thinking about that. It's just like, well, when hasn't there been a crisis, right? We're always in crisis. There's always some sort of crisis going on. And crisis is in fact normalized. Is it a crisis anymore if it's normalized? Now, what crises are we here to talk about? Are we here to talk about a crisis of war, a crisis of democracy, a crisis of globalization, a crisis of neoliberalism, of a multicultural, multiracial society? But that may be, but we're not here to talk about, say, we're not probably really going to talk about the homeless crisis. We're not going to talk about the healthcare crisis probably that much. We're certainly not going to talk about the AIDS crisis. So I think we have to move beyond this language of crisis. And similarly, also, I've never really liked resistance, just like, some people are calling this the post-truth moment. Like I said, you don't know what's after post-truth. Same with resistance, is you actually don't know what you're standing for. If we think of resistance in the sense of physics, you're pushing against an opposing force. So when we talk about resistance, we're always defining ourselves in relation to that opposing force. We're not saying what we're actually standing for. But I think resistance can be a useful can still be of use going forward, because there are things that we do need to resist. And even though we think of resistance in a physical way, resistance is forged, I think, more in the mind than in the body. So what we have to resist going forward is we have to resist the attempt that is started already to normalize the grotesque. We have to resist accepting the awful as an acceptable trade-off to the atrocious. We have to resist kind of the drive toward passivity, resist a Pollyannish faith in a broken democracy and corrupted institutions. But we also need to resist fear, despair, and paranoia, right? These are emotions that give in to the ruling elite. And it means that we have to learn how to resist the lies, the propaganda, the confusion, and hypocrisy. We also need to resist the pressure to put the weight of the world on our shoulders and the temptation to retreat from the world. There'll be plenty of people who will just want to retreat from the world in consumerism, into play, and that's going to be a reality, but we need to resist that as much as possible. We also need to resist turning on each other or going it alone. That is, of course, one of the big dangers. Right now, I'm seeing in organizing, a lot of differences and conflicts are being papered over, and we need to have those conflicts out in the open in an honest, productive way, but we need to resist attacking each other. That's one of the things that didn't Occupy, really. And what we do need to do is we need to normalize dissent and outrage, non-cooperation, and resistance to every horrendous action.